Anyway, we will move on, so we won't be as late as I thought we would. We're going to be okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Pepling. We will turn to our final talk, which is the conference closing talk. And I'm very pleased to introduce to you Anne Goff. She is a bioethicist and postdoctoral scholar at the UCLA Institute for Society and Genetics. She studies the field of epigenetics and especially the implications of epigenetics on reproduction in an intergenerational and transgenerational manner. Dr. Goff, you can share your screen. We see you. There you go.
And now you see the screen. Perfect.
Okay.
All right. So thank you very much, Jill. And as I have the honor of being the last one to speak today, I would like to thank you for the organization of this great conference. That was absolutely amazing. And I'm happy to talk now about a different angle than what we saw in these past sessions. Is what does this evidence that we've been learning about, what does it mean in terms of ethical obligations? So I'm coming from UCLA, from the Institute for Society and Genetics, and the work I'm doing to talk about today has been conducted with Hannah Landecker. So today I'm going to focus on three main questions. First, the question is, what kind of obligation result from this evidence that we've had, that we now have? And if there is indeed, as I will argue, a responsibility for this effect for future generation affected by such effects, is it an individual responsibility or is it rather a collective responsibility? And in the third part of my talk, I will suggest a parallel to heritable effects of genome editing as a way of focusing on the germline and on our ethical responsibilities about the germline. So first, a little summary of what we've heard in this conference and the different streams of evidence. So some from the genome, which we haven't heard so much in this conference, mitochondrial effects, which was just discussed, are still not much studied, and then epigenetic effects, which we have learned a lot about with the conference. All the streams of evidence contribute to show that there are germ cell effects and heritable effects, and those give rise to have been demonstrated through association in animals and also some in humans. So what do we do with that? And what do they do, the people in the picture, and what do we do for them? So a second stream of knowledge is patient and advocates knowledge. And we've heard in the conference, first of Germline exposure that is bringing this conference to us, but also DS Action, birth defect research in children. All this advocates have built some knowledge, and it's a question of what kind of evidence it is. But I think this knowledge is very important for first for bringing to view these effects that are largely invisible, and that's one of the big issues in terms of what the moral considerations that we can give to this effect in future generation is that the effects are invisible because they occur over such a long time. So it's very important that the people who to whom they're actually visible because they experience them or their loved one experience them, that we listen to them. And second, the voice of people who are directly implicated is also important in terms of rights, of what they're entitled to in terms of right to research, right to knowledge, right to sue companies if effects are proven to exist. So what's the state of research and regulation today in terms of heritable effects? Well, as other speakers have talked about, in particular David Demarani and Francesco Marchetti, there's not that much regulation right now. So both in terms of regulation of chemicals and drugs at the national and international level. And in terms of research, germ cells are not a focus of research. So there's a bit of a contradictory situation here. On the one hand, we have accumulating evidence, or at least suspicions, hypothesis, that there could be some heritable effects. And the germ cells are highly important for our lives in terms of fertility and reproduction, but also because they impact the health of the next generation in a way that's major, because germ cells are going to be the building blocks for the whole body of the next generation. And potentially, if there are transgenerational effects that go through the germline only, this effect will extend far in the future. So the impact of just germ cell lesions and heritability are huge. And that's quite puzzling why we don't care more for them right now in terms of active regulation and research. And David Demaroni, in particular, has suggested that they are institutional obstacles on top of technological and scientific difficulties that were hard to overcome. But I will suggest that there are also moral obstacles to do that. And before I delve a little deeper into it, I wanted to remind people that this evidence for germ cell lesions and possible heritability, is not new. So here, Rachel Carson and Silent Spring wrote, substances of incredible potential for harm penetrate the germ cells to shatter or alter the very material of heredity, etc. So in the 60s, it was already clear that this threat on germ cells was very serious. So what happened in the meantime? Why haven't we been actively researching this possible toxicity? And what is the difficulty? So I will suggest that the difficulty is also a moral one. So it's a fact that we do not, as a society, and the US is not different than other societies in the world, we do not systematically investigate and regulate germ cell toxicity and heritable effect. And the question is, why should we? And I'm not intending this question to sound sarcastic. I'm actually suggesting that it raises a real problem, a real issue, because the idea that we would have a moral obligation towards future generation is not uncontroversial at all. And the whole discussions, excuse me, and the whole discussion about sustainable development and the right of future generation to have the same resources that we have hinge on that problem, on the fact that do we actually owe them? A lot of us, of course, think that it would be better not to have a negative impact on future generations, but do we owe them the same things as we do our contemporaries, people who live in the present? And this question is problematic because our all ethical frameworks have been from the present, of the here and now, to take the words of philosopher Hans Jonas. So when we think about our obligations, we think about them in the present. To give an example of a typical moral situation, somebody by their behavior hurts another person. And here, there's somebody, the agent, that could be an individual, that could be a company selling a product that is dangerous or that whose toxicity has not been assessed to consumers. So in our normal moral framework, if the agent was the cause and had knowledge of the possible consequences of the action, then they are accountable. They are accountable for the consequences. So that means in moral terms, legal, but also financial terms. And here we take knowledge in a very broad sense. It means that the consequence could just be possible, or the agent should have known that it was possible, even if they actually did not know. So that's how we hold people accountable for their actions. And importantly, an agent is not held responsible for all the consequences deriving from the first consequence, because that could lead to very far consequences, and we would end up not acting anymore. if you were responsible, if you push someone and this someone that derails another, I don't know, their plans, or there has to be a limit somewhere. And that's important to the way we can also be accountable for actions. Otherwise, we would stop being accountable for anything. So how does that apply to non-present effects, to germline effects? So let's look first at somatic effects, both in individuals and in fetuses. So that's the case we just talked about, individual effects. Now, this same framework has been applied to fetal effect. So, for example, companies producing a drug can be found liable for effects in the fetus. So there's the idea that even if the fetus is exposed through their mother's body, they are directly exposed, they're somatically exposed to the toxic drug, for example. Now, what happens in the case of heritable effects when there's no direct somatic exposure? So, two cases. First, in a case of gestational exposure. So, this mother and her child in utero are exposed together. They may have no effect of the exposure, but then when this baby becomes a woman in turn and has a child of her own, then the new child, because it was conceived with germ cells that had born lesions from the exposure, then might have a pathology. So does it mean that the agent is responsible for the pathology in that individual? And that's quite different from the first case because of the time that has elapsed, because of the generations. Similarly, in a non-gestational case of exposure, when the child suffers a pathology from the initial exposure to the mother or father, then there was no direct exposure either. So should actually the agent be considered the cause of the harm that was caused? So we don't have a straightforward way to solve this issue. And to illustrate that, I want to take a closer look at a ruling in the case of a DES third exposure trial. So that was in 1991. And the plaintiff was a little girl, Karen Enright. She had been injured by premature birth because her mother suffered reproductive damage in her reproductive organs because of a DS exposure in utero. So the majority opinion in this judgment, which actually overturned the previous judgment, is that for all we know, the rippling effects of DS exposure may extend for a generation. It is our duty to confine liability within manageable limits. Limiting liability to those who ingested the drug or who were exposed to it in utero serves this purpose. And the dissenting opinion is quite different. The girl should have the same right to sue the drug makers for injuries as mother. She's one of a class of 1,000 persons who have allegedly suffered, etc. I'm not going to read it all. So what's really interesting here is that the majority opinion, they do not deny that the drug caused the pathology of the third generation victim. But nevertheless, they argue that there should not be accountability for this action. And so both judgments taken together really exemplify the difficulty here. In the first case, what the majority opinion highlights is a duty to confine liability within manageable limits. And I want to highlight that it's not just a way of letting companies evade responsibility. It's true that it's important that there is some limits to what we can sue for that's the definition of liability, and that's what allows the law to be effective. If we have no ways of enforcing a law because it's too far in the past, because we cannot find any records, etc., then it empties the laws of its substance. But the dissenting opinion brings to you something that I think is very clear to a lot of us, is that there's something unfair there, because this this girl who suffered the consequences of DS, in a way suffered these consequences in the same way that her mother or her grandmother did. So where is the fairness if she cannot even have a right to sue? So here, what's also interesting is that in the first case, the majority opinion says that the germline makes a difference. It sort of cuts off the exposure causation, while the second opinion says that germline does not make a difference. It doesn't make a difference whether it is somatic or germline mediated. There's in both cases the causation can be established, and so is the accountability. So I think here the second opinion, the dissenting opinion, is the strongest, because they make an essential point, which is the heritable effects of toxic exposure are not random. That's what we see from all the scientific evidence. It's not like a de novo mutation that will create a genetic pathology, but that came randomly. It can be traced to human technologies, hence it can be traced to human choices. And whenever there's a choice, there's a responsibility. So there's a responsibility, but the difficulty is that we don't have really the ways of managing or thinking these responsibilities. So we need to find new ways of managing this kind of responsibility. So in the DS judgment I just quoted from, they're right, the majority judgment is right in saying we don't have the way of managing this, but it's not a reason it's not a reason to dismiss our responsibility. It's a reason to work on how to develop this kind of responsibility. And here, a retrospective account doesn't quite work. So we usually, the way we do when there's some toxic exposure and liability, then there's blame that's attributed to the agent. Here it doesn't work because germ cell effects are latent. It means that they occur very much later in life, or in the next generation, or even after that. So there's no shared time between the people who are affected and the people who acted, or the companies that acted. And everything that's left is what other scholars have called a chemical legacy. And a legacy it's a unidirectional relationship. You cannot do anything except accept the legacy. And in the same way, germ cell effects are not discrete, so they don't produce a direct pathology. They're predisposed to pathology, creating genomic instability. So the framework of individual actions is not relevant, except probably for cases of acute exposure. In cases of low exposure, it's going to be impossible to pinpoint an exposure and say this is what caused my pathology. So we have a break between very real pathologies and not being able to pinpoint the causes. So it means that in the case of germline effects, we need to anticipate responsibility. We need to reconceptualize our technologies as bearing effect not in the present, but in the future. And right now, the way we think about ethical responsibilities for technologies, be it medical technologies or chemical technologies, we think about them in the present. Is this a chemical compound, this pesticide, for example, is it toxic to the people who are going to use it, or to the people who live in the area and will be exposed to it? We don't think about it in terms of generations. So there's a complete shift that we need to do here in order to anticipate. But once we said that we need to anticipate effect in order to act responsibly, the question is who should anticipate? Is it the state? And indeed, the state is the regulators through policies of hazardous substances, but germ cells have been excluded so far. Or is it individuals? And individuals is actually the response that has been the most prominent recently. So let me look at it first. There's the idea that because individuals carry germ cells in their own body, they're in charge of protecting future generations by protecting their own germ cells. And this idea has some very similar in a way, because it stems from the idea that parents have an obligation to protect their children. So can we not extend that to future children? That's the reasoning. And this suggestion has been particularly strong in the area of epigenetics, with the discovery of intergenerational and transgenerational effects of epigenetics. So there have been a lot of injunctions through the media, but also sometimes through in the way researchers put their findings, that parents had to care for future generation. So both dad, don't stress dad, but mostly mothers. So for the next generation in nutrition, but even for future generations. And so is that an accurate description of the moral obligations that are here? Well, if we take a case of acute exposure, nobody would probably hold that, because if this man here was exposed to general anesthesia when he was a kid, or this woman was exposed in utero to DES, we would not say that they're responsible for whatever effects would occur in their children, because their exposure was involuntary. They did not make the choice to be exposed. I would argue that it's actually the same for all kinds of exposures. If we think about in this picture, so the endocrine disruptors, that might be in the plastic bottles, the pollution from the air we breathe, all that cannot be regulated by individuals. Now, if we talk about something that's more a lifestyle choice, like smoking here, or the kind of diet you'll have, well, those, even though they depend to an extent on the choice of the individual, are highly dependent on socio-economical status. So it's not it's not completely in their own choice either. So toxic exposures are in the responsibility of the collective that will put forward regulations for chemical compounds used in the environment and in drugs. So the harm that's been done is not a harm from parents or ancestor onto future children. It's rather a multi-generation harm that is completely novel, because it encompasses several generations that suffered different kind of harms, but all related. So now, how can we think about devising a collective responsibility for this kind of exposures? So we can take some ideas from the ethics of human heritable genome editing. And it's quite striking that while nobody talks about heritable effects of exposure, the effects of human heritable genome editing have been massively discussed, and for good reasons. But there's really a contrast here. And so from the beginning, CRISPR-Cas9 was invented in 2015. So Jennifer Doudna really insisted on the need to have an ethical scrutiny about it. And that became even more manifest in 2018, when a scientist edited the genome of 2 embryos that actually became babies. So it's very clear and non-controversial that the germline morally matters, and that scientists have a responsibility toward future humans in this context. So my question is, can we translate this reflection, this ethical reflection, and this ethical model that is being developed in this context, can we translate it into the field of toxic exposure. And of course, there are strong differences. And one difference is between something that's extraordinary, genome editing, versus ordinary, which is many technologies that we use in our ordinary life. And that's certainly why one has gotten a lot of attention, while the other has not. But there's also a difference in terms of intention. So in the case of human genome editing, there's an intentional intervention on the germline genome. So it's a germline intervention. The goal is to change the germline. While in the case, so for example, of general anesthesia, the intervention is not on the genome. The intervention is on the patient in order to allow surgery to proceed. So whatever intervention they might have on the germline genome through germ cells is not intentional. It's not there. It's not in the scope of responsibility that are identified by practitioners and by the community. So the focus is laid in very different points, and I would argue that's why it has not been recognized that much that technologies such as general anesthesia or pesticides are also germline technologies. So what kind of lessons can we draw from the discussions on the ethics of human heritable genome editing? The first one is to identify germline and germ cells as a point of intervention. So it's not just effects on germ cells are not just unintended effects. They're a point of intervention, even if it's not intentional. And it's key to distinguish these effects from somatic effects, because as we've seen in this conference, the biological effects are not the same at all. So they need to be highlighted in their difference. And also, germline effects should be seen as a possible objection to the technology, which is not the case at all. Right now, technology is accepted, regulated as acceptable if it doesn't have somatic effects, including reproductive effects, but not germline effects. So that's a huge burden, of course. And that's probably why this question hasn't been raised really in the past decades, because that might require from us that we renounce or that we put into question some of our important technologies. So that are the lessons we can take from this ethical debate, but that implies to recognize that interventions on the germline take place not only in the lab with CRISPR, but also outside of the lab in our ordinary life. Second lesson, so think about our technologies are future-oriented, not in terms of long-term effects and not short-term effects. And that includes the obligation to anticipate, which has been taken very seriously in the realm of heritable genome editing. And the next point is that collective effects require collective choice. So collective effects, because what might be significant, both in case of intentional and non-intentional modification of the genome, what might be significant in not this one action, so this one individual responsibility, but the accumulation of interventions that creates a significant choice in the genome or a significant instability that we create pathology. And it is not just a matter of moral thinking. This moral thinking and responsibility can occur only if we invent and develop new forms of infrastructure. So that means sustainable funding, so that we can actually follow up next generations. And that mean concrete ways of archiving, of having data saved, in order that people who think in 3 generations might have a pathology that derives from something that happened in their ancestor, that they can actually take action. What's missing from the debate on genome editing is the fact that there's a focus on the genome, and that it's not really highlighted that the genome is located materially in germ cells. And that makes things more complex, as the editing tends to suggest that there's one clear, neat cut somewhere, while in fact, what we're seeing with germ cell effects of exposure, that creates very complex effects and genomic instability. There are layers of generational effects from that can combine in different generations. So what we need is to have not just the genome, but the germ cells in their physical existence in bodies as a site of vulnerability and concern. And finally, what's missing is the fact that the germline has a social life, so that we're not focusing just on the framework on the lab, but on everything that can be a source of exposure to germ cells. Additionally, it needs to encompass germline inequalities, because germline exposures are tied very closely through the environment to socioeconomic inequalities. So inequalities that go through the germline will propagate into further generations. So that's something that's been not present in discussion of CRISPR-Cas9, and visible also in the way that this discussion have taken place among experts rather than society-wide. So I think something that discussions about heritable effects of germ cell exposure can highlight is a wide participation of civil society, of the public. So in conclusion, I'm sorry, I'm taking a little long here. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that taking in the scientific evidence of intergenerational effects of toxic exposure requires profound changes in our ways of conceptualizing responsibility, conceptualizing the effects of our technologies. And they required work on this new framework, but also have for consequence the need to increase the research to document such effects and develop appropriate infrastructure. And when we do that, then we can do more than say, okay, we cannot account for those effects because they're just too long past. We can actually devise a form of accountability for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goff. Very fascinating talk, very thought-provoking. As a former lawyer, I appreciated your including the DES case. Okay, I also want to say that last year, my husband, who knows nothing about science, was talking to me about the work I do. And he said, so Jill, what you're kind of saying is that we're always a little bit pregnant. He's referring to males and females. And I thought, oh my God, he nailed it. Yes, until you conceive your last child, you are always a little bit pregnant. And we don't have that mentality, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, when I wrote that paper for environmental epigenetics, raising the questions about heritable impacts of general anesthesia, and I wrote it with a colleague who had been a practicing anesthesiologist. And she just said to me, listen, through all my years of training, through all my years of practice, through all my years of going to conferences and reading journals, not once had anybody even brought up the question about the patient's germ cells. Mm-hmm. She anesthetized, thousands of patients, and it never even occurred to her mm-hmm. as something, because I think we don't have that mentality of even thinking about, we're always a little bit pregnant. Anyway, enough mm-hmm. about me. First question, you're in Los Angeles. Is slide 1 a picture of the coast of California? And is that the area where some company dumped 500,000 barrels of DDT between the 1950s and 1970s? That was a big story in the LA Times?
Slide 1 was not a picture of the coast of California, but that's very relevant, and that's that goes back exactly to, I think, the failure of collective responsibility at many different levels, at the level of research regulation and even exploiting the communities like that.
A very thought-provoking talk. Thank you. 3 linked questions. What is the responsibility of individuals who are aware that they may be at risk of transmitting abnormalities via their germ cells? Should They avoid all procreation to avoid the risk of producing offspring who may inherit an abnormality. What is the impact of the fact that we are dealing with risk rather than certainty in these cases? Oh, what a great question.
Thank you. Yes, great questions. So the first question about the responsibility towards one's possible children of whether transmitting abnormalities. This is a very difficult one because then if it's the case of is transmitting existence not better in any way, I think there is I think it might be a little bit of a fake question, not fake, but I'm sorry. Sometimes the English is not so good. Um, it might be asking the wrong question, in the sense that it focuses the responsibility on the individual that should be responsible for their own body. And in fact, I think the responsibility is not on the individual here because they did not. They did not damage their own body or expose themselves. Or the responsibility is on the agent, either individual or company, or collective that did the exposure in the first place. So what I argue is that there's a multidirectional exposure that the parent and the child who would maybe carry an abnormality as a result from being procreated by this parent, that they both share harm. But I would argue that there's no relationship of responsibility at the conception level. Then your point about risk, I think this is a very important point. I'm glad you're bringing it up. That is one of the huge difficulty of anticipating the effects of our technologies here. We're dealing only about risk. There's no certainty. And so that's why, so that still creates a number of obligations. First, this risk, only because it's not a certainty, cannot be discounted because we will never have the certainty. So that would be a wrong reason not to act on risk. Second, the risk should be included in the choices proposed to individuals. They should be aware of the risk. So if we take the case of anesthesia, if there's a risk to germ cells, it should be included, even if we're not able to completely assess it. And we're doing that in a lot of cases today. We have models of risk, and that does not prevent us from making decisions. So an argument that has been used in the case of germ cell effects. So, for example, in the case of veterans asking for compensations for Agent Orange, it's very striking that the studies by the National Academies say repeatedly that we don't have enough evidence. We don't know, we need more evidence. So that's not the right answer here, because we will never be able to fully quantify the effects, but we're able to, if we do the studies, we're able to quantify some level of risk. So that's, I think that's a big difference also in the model of actions that I was trying to distinguish. In our classical model of action, it's a backwards looking model. So we're assessing blame afterwards. What we need for long-term effects, we need to act by anticipation. So we cannot act on the certainty of what happened, because we need to act with the provision of what might happen.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, this question makes me think. A couple of years ago, I gave a talk to a general audience about autism, and I mentioned that I have 2 children with nonverbal autism. And these people in the audience took me to task, asking me, why did you have another child? Why, what were you thinking? Basically, they were saying, like, why were you transmitting your germ cells again? You should have known that your germ cells were broken in some sense. And I'm like, I didn't know there was any, I had no idea that I was in an increased risk. I really didn't. And knowing now what I know now, would I've had another child? I don't know. But anyway, it's very interesting question. Okay, there are 2 more questions. How do you think about reproductive justice goals and how they might intersect with your argument?
Thank you. Yes, I think that's a great way of putting it too. that so I think it's a case of reproductive justice. Reproductive justice has been thought in terms of both extending rights for everybody to be able to have the kind of family they want, either 0 children, some children, many children, and also with environmental justice, environmental reproductive justice. So the fact that some people are um, uh, um, some people ability to reproduce in the way they want is compromised by their environment in a way that's not socially equal. So here, that I would say that the case of heritable effects completely fits into the questions of environmental reproductive justice and shows that it extends further than we thought. It's not just environmental justice in the present, it can extend very far into the future. And both closely intersect, because we see that injustices that exist in the present, for example, in exposures to toxic industry, then this inequality is going to be propagated very far into the future, because it will be propagated through germline, creating new pathologies in the next generation, for example, learning disabilities, or so that furthers the inequalities it starts from.
There you go. Finally, from Dr. Mansui, regarding individual responsibility, there are many toxicants that people intentionally take: tobacco, drugs of abuse, alcohol, and that have effects on germ cells. Thus, would not these people then be liable for the consequences on their children?
Yes, so that's the case. The lifestyle choices. That's the case where it would seem most clear that people actually have a responsibility for what they're doing. But I argue that it's actually more complicated than that, because this reasoning equates parental responsibility with born children and a responsibility with future potential children that are not born. And I argue that it's not the same thing. So if you're using drugs or any kind of drug, it is your choice to hurt yourself with that, and that includes your germ cells. But your germ cells are not your children. It's not the same thing. So so that's the first point. So you could sorry, I think this argument is going the wrong way, because then you could also apply it to other cases. I think I will go back to the argument that I said during the talk, but quickly. It's that this use of drugs is highly correlated with socioeconomic status. So it applies in some cases that people actually have a choice whether they're going to use drugs or not. In many cases, people don't really have the same options of living in an environment that's drug-free, or accessing the right food, or etc. They're in an environment that promotes abuse or drug use. So the idea that individuals would be systematically responsible for these choices overlooks this context, and so that undermines their responsibility toward other people who would be born from them. I'm happy to talk more about it. I know that my answer is a little convoluted.
All right. Well, we're definitely over time, but I want to thank all of our speakers today for an excellent final session in our series. And we hope to have everything recorded and linked on the website, and we'll send out an email with all of those links. But thank you so very much to everybody. And thank you especially to Bob, who was our tech guy behind the scenes and who helped make everything run very smoothly. So I'm signing off, and I wish everybody a very happy holiday season.